people are intimidated by the thought of having to bind their own quilt. But today I'm going to talk to you about 3 popular ways of binding your quilt, and I'm going to show you the way that I prefer to do it. I'm going to show you the tools and the whole technique to bind it on the machine and hopefully take that fear away from you so that you too can be empowered to bind your own quilts with ease. So when we're talking about binding a quilt, we're looking at a quilted piece. We have the top, we have the back, you have your stitching all the way through already, but now what you're looking at is the batting on the inside and all these raw edges, and it's very unsightly. If you're going to use your quilt like this, it's going to deteriorate in no time. What we have to do as quilters is put a nice trim border edge all the way around our quilt that keeps that batting and those raw edges nice and clean. I want to talk to you real quick about some of the ways that people generally like to bind their quilt. There is what I consider the lazy man's way of doing it. There are folks who will keep the backing fabric wide, and they'll cut it maybe 2 inches wider than the quilt top is, so it's 2 inches all the way around. And once the quilt is quilted, then they'll take that extra on the outside edges and fold it in and fold it over. So the backing fabric now folds over to make the binding. The problem with that is that when you quilt, you need a place for your design to stop. If you look at this one here, my diagonals stop right there where my border, or excuse me, where my binding starts. It's finished, it's clean. If I used backing fabric to just fold over, then where does my quilting actually end? It's really hard to see, and it makes it kind of sloppy. That kind of method is good for quick weekend baby quilts that you can quickly hide and you're not looking at a whole lot of detail on. Another way of doing your binding is to cut strips. Now, you can either cut strips on the cross grain, that is with the fabric from selvage to selvage. You cut your strips that way and you join your strips together. Or you can do what was used back in the day, which is create bias strips. Now the bias is a 45-degree angle on your fabric. It's that diagonal that has a lot of stretch to it. Bias binding is really fabulous when you have a scalloped edged quilt where it's curved. The bias binding will allow you to go around those curves and into those corners really nicely and keep the binding flat and smooth without puckering or twisting. The binding that I use is the one that's cut on the cross grain from selvage to selvage. Now the reason that I like to do that is, frankly, the majority of our quilts that we do have straight edges. Our edges are not scalloped, they're straight. So why go through the bother of having to create bias binding, which honestly is a bit of a hassle, but I can make that video too if you guys really want to see how to do that. But it's a little bit of extra work that you have to go through. Why go through it if you just need a straight line? What I'm going to show you today is how to cut your cross grain binding fabric so that you can join all of those together in a nice long strip, and that's going to go all the way around your quilt. Now, the sample that I'm going to use it's not quilted. I spray basted some fabric onto my batting. You can see the batting right here. In order to figure out how much binding I'm going to need, I have a formula. So in order to find the amount of binding that you need to first measure the perimeter of your quilt, whatever that may be. Mine is 16.5 by 16.5, which brings me to 66 inches. So my perimeter is 66 inches. I'm going to take that perimeter and add 10 inches to it. You'll figure out why in a bit. Adding that 10 inches is going to bring me to 76 inches. All right, so that's the length that I need to make sure that I cover, but then I need to figure out how many strips I'm gonna need. So the way you do that is you take that perimeter measure, 76 in my case, and you're going to divide it by the width of fabric, which is generally somewhere between 42 and 45 inches. I generally use 42 just because it's on the low side. So 76 divided by 42 is going to give me 1.809, 1.81. That tells me how many strips I need. I need 2 strips of fabric, cut width of fabric from selvage to selvage. That's basically going to get me to, what is it, 84 inches worth of fabric, and that's going to be great. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 strips of fabric at 42 inches each, cross grain of course, and then I'm going to join them together. So you guys can see that I have 2 strips of fabric here. This is going to be enough fabric to go all the way around that sample quilt that I have. So I need to join them together. There are a couple ways that you can join them together, honestly. You can butt up the selvages like this, fold one over, and just stitch a straight line parallel with that short edge of your binding strip. The problem with that, though, for as easy as it is, when you open it up and fold it over, you end up with this bulky double seam thing that is going across your binding that you have to now stitch over. It ends up just being too bulky. What you really want to do it with any point in your quilting is to disperse whatever bulk of fabric that you have. And so the best way to do that is to stitch it on the diagonal. So this is how you need to think about it. Okay, so what you need to do is have 1 strip horizontally in front of you like this with the face up, fabric face up. And then you're going to take your second strip and it's going to lay perpendicular to your first strip, face down. So we're going to turn this over just like this. And it is perfectly fine. In fact, I would recommend having a little bit of fabric overhanging at the top and on the side, simply because, especially in this case, we're dealing with the selvage on both edges. They're the clean edges, but you see all these little pinholes going across, and you can even see some coming down this way. We want to avoid the pinholes as much as we possibly can. So you're going to make sure that those are hanging off. I'm going to take a ruler. Any ruler is fine. Once you have your fabrics placed correctly, one is facing up horizontally and the other is face down vertically, you're going to draw a diagonal line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner, just like that. This is a line that you're going to sew directly on top of. Please do not go to either side, stay right on top of it. So let me go ahead and pin this, and then we're going to sew it on the machine. When I start sewing my corners here, I always start with my needle in the down position. So what I have here is now just a straight diagonal line, and I'm going to cut off this excess here. You can use your scissors to do this, or if you want to use your rotary cutter. When you're trimming it, it does not have to be an exact 1/4 of an inch. You just need to make sure that you leave enough of a seam allowance that it's not going to separate in the making. Now at this point, what I have, if I open it up, is one continuous length of fabric. And you can see, because I started right in the corner and ended right in the corner, my fabric line across the top and across the bottom are the same. That's what you're looking for. So I'm going to take it to the ironing board and I'm going to press this seam open. It's very important to press it open because, like I said before, we're looking to disperse the bulk of our fabric so that it doesn't get too thick and heavy as you're stitching down your binding. All right, so I went ahead and pressed, I know it looks a little bit different, I pressed the seam that I just stitched, the diagonal, I pressed that open. You can see how nice and flat that is. Now the second thing that I did that I didn't exactly show you was just to take my 2.5 inch wide strip and fold it in half. And I pressed it all the way down, all along the binding in half like this. Now, I don't know if I mentioned before, your binding strips are cut. Always cut them at 2.5 inches. Always cut your binding strips 2.5 inches wide. So that's what I have here. Folding it in half gives me 1.25 inches of binding width. So what I'm going to do now, and I have enough green binding here that will go all the way around my sample quilt. I'm going to now position my binding on my quilt and pin to start stitching. It's at this point that you want to stop and ask yourself, am I going to sew my binding on completely on the machine? That means attach it the first round on the machine and then the second round on the machine? Or do I want to do it first round, attach the binding to the quilt by machine, and then the second round finish it by hand? A lot of people enjoy doing hand binding, which I also feel is enjoyable, but I don't always have time to do it. Doing it by hand, it might take me about, I don't know, it might take me 45 minutes, I guess, 30, 45 minutes to get this done, just finishing it by hand. But if I do it on the machine, it's gonna take a snap. So that's the way that I'm gonna show you guys to do it. If you're going to finish it by hand, then you are first going to attach your binding to the top, to the front of your quilt, stitch it down, you're gonna fold it over, and then on the back, you would finish it. Since we're going to do all of the binding on the machine, you're first going to attach your binding strip to the back of the quilt so that you're able to fold it over onto the front and finish it on the front. You're gonna see what I mean. So to start, I'm going to position the end of my binding strip on my quilt top. I don't want to start sewing right at the beginning of the binding strip. I want to leave about 10 inches of wiggle room. Okay, so move in by about 10 inches. And then I'm going to attach my binding to my quilt top. I use 2 pins to keep the binding strip, the raw edges of the binding strip along the raw edge of the quilt. Now I'm going to sew around. When I get to this point here, about 1/2 of an inch away from the edge, I'm going to stop, and you're going to see me do a little bit of strange origami. The fold that you're going to create here is going to be the reason you will be able to have a nice, clean, mitered corner. Mitered means that it's on the diagonal corner in your binding on the front and on the back. I have my standard presser foot here. For my machine, from the center of my presser foot to the edge of my presser foot is 3/8 of an inch. And honestly, that is the distance that you really do want to have with your seam allowance for your binding coming around the first time. So I have 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to put my needle down, and then I'm going to stitch 2 stitches backward, and then I'm going to come back forward. And remember, I'm going to stop about 1/2 of an inch before I get to the edge. Now at this point, I'm going to raise my needle and my presser foot. I'm going to take my fabric out and turn it 90 degrees. Yes, the thread, the bobbin thread is still attached and the top thread is still attached. Don't cut it. I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to fold it up. Now there are a few things that I want you to pay close attention to with this. When I fold it up, I want a nice crisp 45-degree angle coming right to the corner. So my binding, the cut edge of my binding runs right into the cut edge of my quilt right at the corner. I know that I'm straight, my binding is straight because the folded edge of my binding is running parallel to the cut edge of my quilt. Now, some people might say, oh, well, what does it really matter? It really does matter, because if I do this, I have a diagonal here and it meets up at the corner, but this bit is not straight, this folded edge is not parallel with my cut edge, then my binding is not going to be sufficient to fold over and create the mitered corner that is necessary. So I need to make sure that this folded edge of my binding is parallel with the cut edge of my quilt. So I have those 2 things in place. I'm going to just put my finger to hold it down and then bring my binding back down. At this point, what I'm looking for is for this fold that I'm creating to be in line with the top edge of the cut edge of my quilt, just like that. Once I have everything in place, slide it back in and continue. There are threads that are still exposed back there, but that's okay. That'll all be taken care of in the end. Now we're coming around the last corner. I'm going to make sure that I stop sewing to allow maybe a 10 to 12 inch gap between where I started sewing and where I stopped. That's going to leave me a lot of fabric binding fabric that's just flopping around. That is so very important. You're gonna see why in just a sec. Let me finish this up. So what we have here is an extra flap of binding where we started. We have a generous extra flap of binding from where we ended. And we have a good amount of space in between. What we're gonna do now is close up this binding. Just like when we joined the two strips together on that diagonal, we want to do the same thing when closing up the quilt or closing up the binding strips. What I use, and there are lots of different techniques out there, using rulers or not using rulers, but what I use is this binding tool. It is such a huge help, and I believe I have some in the shop for you to purchase. So there will be a link below so that you can actually, if you don't have one, you can grab one and use it, because this is such a huge help, guys. Now, the way the binding tool works, the tool itself is 2.5 inches in width. Well, that's the same width as your binding, right? It also gives you a straight line down here that is going to be a good reference mark for when you do your second cut. You have a 45-degree edge on it. This is the first cut that you're going to make. And instead of it being pointed at the tip, they've blunted it. And this part is actually going to represent the 1/4 inch mark. I'll show you exactly how that all works together. But these 3 elements, along with it being that 2.5 inches in width, those things are going to give you the exact size of to cut and to sew for your binding pieces to go together on that diagonal. So what you're going to do is open up your binding and lay your tool on top of your binding. It doesn't matter really where, but you want the diagonal of the tool to be somewhere in the middle of that gap that you've created. So you lay your tool on top of your binding, and I'm going to carefully cut my diagonal like that and then blunt off that tip like so. So what I have now is a nice 45-degree angle with a 1/4 inch edge on it. The next step is going to be to lay the other side of your binding down and overlap the one that you just cut. That little blunted end that we created is going to be where you mark on the long piece that now needs to be cut. The mark doesn't have to be large, it just needs to be dark enough for you to see right now. I'm going to open up the binding again, this side. At first I used my binding tool with the diagonal on the left-hand side. Now I'm going to turn it around, rotate it, so that my diagonal is now going to be on my right-hand side. Using that mark, that long mark on it, I'm going to line that up with a little notch mark that I made, and I'm going to cut, and I'm going to cut that blunt edge. So now what I have are 2 pieces that fit perfectly together like so. We have to now sew them together. That blunted end on both pieces actually take into consideration the seam allowance. I'm going to line up the edge, this blunted edge, with the long cut edge of my fabric on one side, and then do the same thing on the other side. Now here's a tip. We're now dealing with the bias edge of your fabric, which means that the fabric wants to stretch a whole lot. We don't want it to stretch a whole lot as we're sewing it. So I always put my pins in first on the outer edges, and then I'm going to put 2 more pins in the middle, but I'm not going to stretch and distort my fabric. You just want to hold it together so that as it's being fed through the machine, it's not going to pull. If it does pull, then you're going to end up with rippling, and that's just not pretty. So what I've now created is this seam along a diagonal, that bias edge diagonal. If I relax it and just pull it together, it is now the same size as my quilt. So my seam is now going to fit perfectly, or my binding rather is now going to fit perfectly along the edge of my quilt. It's all been trimmed. Now remember when we were talking about the bulk that's created by the seam? You can see here in this example how the seam is on the diagonal, and how that diagonal, if it's folded over, is going to disperse the bulkiness of the seam across a wider area. so it doesn't end up being as thick and bulky. I'm going to press this seam open just like I pressed the other one open, press it flat, and then just stitch this closed. Now, as I'm going along, as I'm stitching this down, I'm gonna see that it seems like the quilt is a little bit bigger than my binding, but in actuality, we're in good shape, because the fabric for the binding was cut on the cross grain, and there is a little bit of stretch that goes into the cross grain, and you're gonna see in the very end that it really is the right size. So just give it a gentle tug as you're going along, as you're stitching that last bit down. I promise it will work. I have not had a quilt where it does not work yet. And guys, if you have any questions as I'm working with this tool, or you've tried it yourself and you've come across problems and you want to figure out how you can make yours better, drop it in the comments, ask me a question. I would be so thrilled to help you guys answer any questions that you have. So I've closed it all up. You see that my space has been closed. I have no puckers, I have no wrinkles, I have everything fits perfectly all the way around. Now my next step to my binding is going to be to press this. I'm going to press it flat all the way around, and then I'm going to show you how to fold it over to stitch from the front side of the quilt. I went to the ironing board and I pressed all of my binding flat and open. Okay, so it's attached to the back of my quilt, and I just use the iron to gently press it flat so that it's not going to bubble and pucker. Because this next step is going to be fold over from the back onto the front of the quilt. Now, normally when you are doing your binding, you're doing any kind of stitching, you're trying to match your thread to the fabrics that you're using. But in this case, I used a black thread because I want you to see exactly where the seams are and what you're going to be looking for as you are replicating this step. The binding is just the right size, so that with this 3/8 of an inch seam allowance that was created when you put the binding on the back, when you fold it over, the folded edge of the binding now is able to cover that seam that you created. I'm showing it to you in black. I did a couple of pins here to hold it in place. But what you're trying to look for, guys, is to make sure that this fold covers that black stitching. The next step is going to be to put it under your machine and then sew 1/8 of an inch. I know that it sounds super close, but you need to make sure that it's 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge of your binding. What that's going to do is it's going to allow the needle to go through this side of the binding, the back side of the binding. It's going to look like you put the binding on all at one time. The stitching is not going to fall off onto the white of the quilt. It's going to stay on the green. Keep that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the left edge of your binding, and make sure that your binding is just covering that stitching. So on my machine, this little red dot, either one of these 2 red dots, indicates 1/8 of an inch from the center of the presser foot where my needle is defaulted. So the left hand red mark is going to follow this left edge, folded edge of my binding all the way around. That's going to indicate to me that I'm going through the top of the binding and the back of the binding at the same time. I am going to back stitch just 1 or 2 stitches, and I'm keeping a close eye right here to make sure that my binding is in line with that 1/8 of an inch red mark. I work in small lengths so that I can make sure that I keep my binding covering that seam underneath, that black seam that you saw. Now, about 1 inch, 2 inches away from the corner, I'm gonna stop because I need to do some pinning. I use 3 pins on each corner. I put 1 pin in on that vertical run, make sure that it is secure. And then you see how I pulled the fabric down with my index finger? I need the fabric to be as flat as it can get, and then fold it up. So bring it down and fold it up. There is that miter that I'm ultimately looking to create. It is replicated on the back of the quilt. I'm going to pin that miter so that stays in place. And in creating the miter, I'm also covering up the horizontal seam that needs to be covered. So I'm going to stitch down. I'm going to sink my needle, and with my needle down right on that miter, raise my presser foot, turn my fabric, and then come down along this edge. It seems like you're going really far, but you're not. Raise my presser foot, needle is down. Please make sure your needle's down. Turn it 90 degrees, cover it up, and if you can see, my fabric is still in line with that 1/8 inch mark on my presser foot. So what I do want you to notice is I come along my length, my seam is very, very even and regular from the inside edge of my binding, and I'm covering that stitching. Now, if you look underneath the stitching or underneath the fold, you can see the stitching there. But if I was actually making this quilt for real, I would use white thread and it wouldn't show. Camouflage. So I come all the way up to my miter corner, needle down, turn, and then come along the next edge. But this is the cool thing that I want you guys to see. On the back, I have the exact same thing going on. Here, it went off a little bit, but I stayed on the binding, turned, and came along, and you can see that I have a nice miter happening in my corner. So it works out really well. I'm going to finish going all the way around and show you the finished product afterward. One other thing that I want you to pay attention to is the sound of the machine. Your machine is going to sound a lot heavier than it normally does, because honestly, you're going through much more fabric than you normally would. If you stop and calculate how many layers of fabric you're going through, it's 2 layers of the binding on the top, 2 layers of the binding on the back, the fold of your binding, that's 2 more, and then 2 layers of fabric, that's your quilt, and your batting. So we're looking at 10 layers of stuff here. The machine is going to sound very heavy. That's okay. As soon as your machine starts sounding light again, it means that you've slipped off of your binding and you're no longer stitching with that black seam right on the binding. It's now slipped off the binding and it's onto the back of the quilt. Don't worry too much if that happens a little bit. This is kind of one of those techniques. It takes a little bit of time to really master on your machine. I've been doing this for years. But once you understand the little nuances of your machine and the measuring and what to look at, then you're going to be able to just do this in a snap, I promise. Don't be discouraged by the heaviness of your machine, because that's what it's supposed to sound like right now. All right, guys, so I made it all the way around my quilt. I am fully bound, and it really didn't take that long, did it? Of course, this is just a 16 by 16 sample, but blah, blah, blah. The last thing you want to do, make sure that you backstitch just to seal it up a little bit. You can see how with the black thread, it has built up a little extra, so you can see that it's a little thicker where I did backstitch. But honestly, when you are quilting, you're stitching with thread that matches your fabric. So you're not going to notice that little extra buildup of thread right there. Make sure that at this point you go ahead and cut close and you're done. Now, just to kind of review, binding was folded just beyond that black stitch line that I had all the way around to cover that up. Once I did that, I positioned my presser foot so that my needle was going to stitch 1/8 of an inch in from that inside edge of the binding. And that allowed me to not only stitch from the front and get the stitching on the front of the binding, but equally on the back of the binding. If you guys have any questions about this technique, please let me know. Also, this binding tool is just the absolute best. But any questions you have, please make sure you ask. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. And share this stuff with your friends, because as I make these videos, guys, I am trying to equip everybody out there with the tools that they need to be able to make their quilts the best that they can. As many tools in your toolbox as you can get, that's what's going to help you to create good, beautiful quilts that satisfy you and absolutely amaze your friends. If you haven't seen it already, I also have a Block of the Month quilt series that I'm working through. You can see it over there. Some of these blocks that are behind me are the ones that you're going to see, some of the ones that you're going to see in that series. So it's a lot of fun, giving you a lot of good tools. So I'll see you in those videos. Bye.